was to create a nation, a nation through which his son would come through. Now, he wanted the nation to represent him, but he gave the people, primarily Jacob, even though the promise came through Abraham, Isaac, and then to Jacob. He allowed Jacob and all the descendants to choose their own path. Now, he could have done it the quick and easy way, right? And predestinate every twist, turn, and then come out with his ultimate go. But that's not God. He wants to use humans and give them free choice to make their decisions, good and bad. And the story of Rachel and Leah and Jacob, you'll see these twists and turns and how things really become complicated. Yeah. And even with all the problems of human choice, problems with human choice because of our human nature, he allowed them to choose based on their greed, their selfishness, their pride, every imaginable sin you can think of. He even allowed the influences of demons and Satan's to influence human decisions. Yet the ultimate goal still comes out perfect as far as God is concerned. But I think he did that to allow humans to make their own choices, to create their own path, is because he wants to teach us something. And he wants to learn. He wants us to learn through experience. So he allowed imperfect humans to make their choices, as I mentioned, right and wrong. And humans are often short-sighted. As I mentioned, they use greed and so on. And still, God is able to complete his plan as he originally envisioned. So the story of Rachel and Leah and also Jacob illustrates how God is sovereign and how he is able to use our mistakes and still come out with a perfect plan. Now the story begins with Rebekah and Isaac. And I should mention before I get here is that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of material, so how much I get through today, I'm not sure. Are we having communion? We're not having communion today. Okay. And so we begin the story with Rebekah and Isaac having this conversation. And you remember Jacob's twin brother, Esau. And Esau married two Hittite women. And the Hittites were somewhat related to the Canaanites. So they had a very aggressive culture, very condescending to other groups. They practiced human sacrifices, particularly babies. And so Esau was beginning to drift away because heavily influenced by his Hittite wives. And it made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. They were very disrespectful and probably very condescending toward them. And as I mentioned, Esau began to drift away, and he began to worship these pagan idols that required human sacrifices. They did not want this to happen to Jacob. And believe it or not, at this time frame, Jacob And Esau, according to the commentaries that I read, they are in their mid-70s. So they're pretty old. But Jacob wasn't married at this time. So they decide to send Jacob to Rebekah's family and find a wife from Rebekah's brother's family. In other words, they want him to marry a cousin, basically. And so they send him, or before they send him, Isaac blesses Jacob and passes on the covenant promises that God made to Abraham. From Abraham to Isaac, now it's to Jacob, to become eventually a community of nations, and then also the blessings of inheriting the land of Canaan, which they have not yet. Now, when you think about it, the only people that were worshiping the one true God at this time was basically Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their families. Now, even Rebekah's family in Haran, that's where Jacob is going to go, they were pagans. They also worshipped idols. So what's the difference between Rebekah's family and the Hittites? No one really knew the true God except Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Bible doesn't really explain why. So I'm guessing that perhaps the family of Rebekah perhaps were a more tolerant culture. Yes, they worshiped idols, but perhaps they were more tolerant of other cultures and accepting their traditions and customs if they decided to marry outside their own family. Maybe one other group might have worshiped God at this time. And you remember Melchizedek during the time of Abraham. And he was the ruler of Salem. So it's quite possible that small group, Salem, which eventually became Jerusalem, of course, Melchizedek probably worshipped the one true God, but we don't have very much information in the Bible. So he goes 500 miles to Haran, where the family is. And he stops by a well of water. And there he meets several shepherds there. And he asks the shepherds, do you know this man Laban of Haran? And they say, yes. And in fact, his daughter, she's a shepherdess. She's right here with us. And waiting for someone to roll the stone away from the well so she can water her sheep. So Jacob moves the stone. He meets Rachel, the youngest of the two daughters, and he tells them that, hey, we're related, we're first cousins, and my mother and your father are brothers and sisters. So she immediately runs back to Haran, tells her father. Her father runs out and greets Jacob. So he stays in Haran with the family for about a month. And within a month, he falls in love with Rachel. And so after a month, Laban, or Laban, depending how you want to pronounce his name, asks Jacob, well, you've been with me a month. How can I repay you for all the time you spend here taking care of the livestock and the sheep and helping Rachel out, because she's the shepherdess of the family. And I think Laban's surprise, Jacob says, well, I really love your younger daughter, Rachel, and I would like to marry her. And I'm willing to work for you for 7 years for her hand. And traditionally, the male, in terms of marriage, normally provides the dowry, and they call the dowry the bride price, and the bride price for Rachel at that time was, for Jacob at least, was he'll offer his labor for the next 7 years for Rachel's hand. Of course, Laban agrees. He thinks it's a real good deal. Well, 7 years pass. There's the wedding celebration and the wedding night. And on the wedding night, it's pretty dark. And part of the tradition is the bride has a very heavy veil across her face. And you really can't see her except maybe her eyes. And I'm sure Jacob had a lot of wine to drink too, but as part of the celebration. So he wakes up the next morning. What does he find? He finds Leah, the older sister, rather than Rachel. And what Laban did was actually deceive Jacob and gave the older daughter, Leah, instead of Rachel. And of course, back then, the daughters really had no say. So they couldn't say anything, they couldn't do anything, they just had to accept what the father told them to do. They were under the total control of the father. So Jacob, flabbergasted in the morning, and he confronts Laban. And Laban tells Jacob, well, it's customary in our family, or most cultures at that time, that the oldest daughter gets married first. And he doesn't apologize for deceiving Jacob. And so Jacob, being an honorable person, accepts Leah. He doesn't love her, but he accepts her as his wife. Now, he still loves Rachel. And he offers to Laban, I still want to marry Rachel, and I will work for you another 7 years. So it'll be a total of 14 years that he'll be working because of his love for Rachel. And obviously, things really become complicated. He has not only 2 wives, but they're 2 sisters, okay? And Leah, being the oldest, I'm sure she finally felt, I'm married and I am the rightful wife. And I know I'm not really loved by Jacob, but hopefully when she has children, Jacob will begin to love her. However, things don't go as planned, okay? And Laban, unfortunately, sacrificed both of their daughters' happiness because of his anxiety, because he wanted to get his daughters married off, particularly Leah. And the tradition at that time were basically to treat their daughters, not their sons, treat their daughters more like property rather than flesh and blood. And so he used his daughters like a bargaining chip. He can be sold, traded, or whatever for his own personal gain. And as if that wasn't enough of a problem, Jacob has 2 wives. And 2 wives was also common, of course. Polygamy was common in many of the ancient cultures at that time. But it's probably fairly rare to be sisters. So he starts his second period of 7 years because he wants to marry Rachel. And so he strikes agreement with his father-in-law after the current wedding ceremony with Leah that he could marry Rachel 1 week after the ceremony, but he still has to work that 7 years. That's extra 7 years, so that was the agreement. They immediately, of course, starts a family. And the Lord blesses Leah first to have children. And immediately, boom, 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 boom. 4 sons, maybe, I guess it's possible in 4 years, maybe 5 years, but it's really quick. And the reason why God chose Leah instead of Rachel to have the first sons was because he felt for her. He knew that she was in love by Jacob, and he knew that Laban deceived everybody and forced Leah onto Jacob. But she became the first mother, the first matriarch of the Jacob household. So with each son, the first 4 sons, Leah had hope that, I have another son. Perhaps Jacob will love me now. But it doesn't happen. So finally, by the 4th son, Judah, she realizes that these are really gifts from God, the children. And now she praises God for the 4 sons. Okay. Meanwhile, Leah is infertile. She's barren. Okay. And she can't have kids. So what she becomes desperate because she's not a mother. She's a wife without kids. And in that culture, it's shameful. And people will disrespect her and ignore her. So she becomes desperate, and when you get desperate, you do desperate things. So he offers her handmaiden, maybe I'm jumping ahead. Let me skip ahead.
Maybe Rachel.
Yeah. So he offers her maidservant, Bilhah, to be a surrogate wife. And because she can't have her own kids. So Jacob accepts. Now he has 3 wives. And Bilhah immediately has 2 sons, right? One right after the other. After the second son, Rachel feels that she's been vindicated, that God finally has blessed her with children, even though they're not her own children, but they're surrogate children. So things kind of get from bad to worse. Okay. So in the meantime, Leah becomes barren as well. She becomes infertile. And perhaps God made her barren is because, Leah has 4 of her own sons. Perhaps she's feeling more superior than Rachel now. And so there's this rivalry going on between the 2 sisters. Jealousy, you name it. And they just don't get along at all. But she is the undisputed matriarch of the family with 4 of her own sons. So now she becomes infertile, And what does she do? She does exactly what Rachel did. She gives her handmaiden, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife. Now he has 4 wives, okay, and 8 sons, okay. Now, ultimately, they have 13 children, 12 sons and 1 daughter. Some commentaries say, and I suppose it's possible, that except for the last one, so we're talking about 12 kids, all 12 were born within 7 years. That 7-year period of labor that he had to do for Rachel's hand. I suppose it's possible, with 4 wives, but it's hard to imagine, okay? And whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. But so up to this point, there's 8 kids now, 8 sons. And you feel for Rachel and Leah's maidservants. I mean, they were innocent bystanders. They became embroiled in a very selfish battle between the 2 sisters. And furthermore, the maidservants had no control of their own sons. It was Leah and Rachel that completely told what the kids could or could not do. Now, Jacob doesn't realize, I think, that he's also a major problem. He could have stepped in and said, no, I'm not going to marry your maidservants. I'm not going to have children with your maidservants. And kind of bit the bullet and stopped the fighting between them. But he didn't do that. He was pretty indifferent about the whole thing. He just kind of went along. And also, because of his love for Rachel, he had gave preferential treatment to her and basically ignored Leah except to have babies, Okay, then this incident happens, and you can read it. My print is kind of small here, and it says, during the wheat harvest, Reuben, he was the first son, went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. Now, the mandrakes were considered an aphrodisiac, okay? It was called the love apple in Hebrew, and it was thought that it would increase the woman's fertility. And at this point, both of them are still infertile. They're both barren, okay? And for Rachel, it was her highest priority to have children, her own children. And for Leah, it was her priority to become fertile again. So since it was Reuben that found the mandrakes, it belonged to Leah, right? So Rachel said, hey, I'll cut a deal with you. Give me some of this mandrake. And this is what she says, I will give you, Leah, permission to sleep with Jacob. And that's kind of, so you don't know what the marriage arrangement is. I'm assuming at least Leah is sleeping in a separate tent. And then there's Jacob and Rachel in another tent. So Rachel gives Leah permission to sleep with Jacob. So it's kind of a strange arrangement here. So we see here that Leah said to her sister, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too? So Leah feels that since she was the first wife and the first mother, and it was a valid marriage, even though it was deceitful, she felt that she should have priority as far as Jacob's attention is concerned. But Jacob isn't, because of his lack of love for Leah, doesn't really pay much attention to her. So, but she still feels that she's the rightful wife and not Rachel. Okay, because the second 7 years haven't been completed yet, even though they're married. So things get really complicated. So Rachel cuts a deal, and then in verse 15, it says, "Very well," Rachel said, "Jacob can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So when Jacob came in from the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him. "I have hired him. That's kind of a strange word. I've hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night, and God listened to Leah. Obviously, she's been praying to God to become fertile again. She became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. So whether Leah actually took the mandrakes or not, it tells us that God was the one that made her fertile again. So she has two more sons. So now that's number 9 and number 10. Nevertheless, Jacob still continues to favor Rachel. And then sometime later, Leah conceives again and has a daughter, Dinah. So there's 11 kids now, 10 boys and 1 daughter. Now, finally, maybe 10 years go by now. I mean, there's 11 kids, at least 10 years, right? Rachel's been facing humiliation, shame, because she doesn't have any of her own children. And finally, she answers Rachel's prayer, and she becomes fertile and has a son. And perhaps God delayed Rachel in her fertility, is that because maybe Rachel felt too much pride of her beauty, and certainly pride of having a loving husband. I mean, she knew that Jacob is working 14 years for her and not for Leah. So now she becomes fertile and has her first son, Joseph. But she realizes also, like Leah, that it's really God's gift. And it didn't come from her scheming or her cheating or bargaining, but it actually comes from God. She realizes that. And she never gave up praying to God either, even though all these years passed and she couldn't become pregnant. Finally, she has a second son named Benjamin. But in her pregnancy with the second son, there are complications. And at childbirth of Benjamin, Rachel passes away. And so it's believed that she might be in her 30s or 40s at this time. Jacob is in his 80s. So there's a total of 13 children now. And so, except for Benjamin, all the other 12 were born in Haran within this 7-year period, or perhaps a little longer. I suspect a little bit longer, because after the second 7-year period, Jacob really, except for his big family, he didn't have any property or even his own livestock. He was taking care of Laban's sheep and livestock. So he says, give me some of your sheep and livestock, and I will work for you another 6 years. So he stays there for another 6 years. Also, in naming of the children, normally it's customary for the husband, in this case Jacob, to name the children with the mother's help. But there's no indication that Jacob really got involved with his children at all, with the exception of Benjamin. And of course, Benjamin being the last one, and also born from his beloved Rachel. And now Rachel is dead. He treats Benjamin very special. And before Rachel passed away, he named the last son Ben-Oni, meaning son of trouble. And probably she felt that because of her complicated delivery, that she was going to pass away. So she named him Ben-Oni. Jacob, after Rachel passes away, renames him to Benjamin, meaning son of my right hand. So it's his favorite son, basically. And he's the one that Jacob focuses on, and not really on the other sons and daughter. And the final outcome of all this rivalry and scheming between the two sisters, it just tells us that God uses humans. He uses their misdeeds and their sinful nature to produce, in this case, a nation of Israel, the 12 tribes. In spite of all the short-sightedness of and lack of wisdom by Leah, Rachel, and Jacob. It tells us God is sovereign, and he will produce his intended outcome. Okay, no matter how humans mess things up. That's basically the story. Well, because of the polygamous marriage arrangement, problems developed immediately, right? And as I mentioned, polygamy was common in those cultures, but it didn't make it right as far as God was concerned. And God allows humans to kind of choose and establish their own cultures, their own tradition, good and bad. And then if you make bad decisions, oftentimes there are unintended consequences. And that's exactly what happened in this marriage arrangement. And a marriage built on preferential treatment, deceit, distrust, obviously will never go well. And that's exactly what happened here. Nevertheless, God loved Leah and Rachel. Even though they were carnal, they were self-serving, he loved them both anyway. And he exercised patience with them, mercy. And you can see in this case how God honored Leah. She was the mother of Judah, and we know out of Judah came Christ. And her third son, Levi, he became the priestly tribe. And Moses and John the Baptist were Levites. Well, when Jacob was ready to pass away, he became to recognize how faithful and loyal Leah was throughout their entire marriage. And she was honored to be buried in what they call the tomb of the patriarchs, where Abraham and Sarah were buried, and Isaac and Rebekah. And his last request to his family before Jacob died was to be buried next to Leah. So I think the lesson in this particular case is that God often chooses to fulfill his plans and purposes by using those who are often overlooked. And that was the case of Leah. Now, Rachel was also honored by God. True that she was barren for most of her married life. She was probably disrespected by a lot of people, and she felt ashamed because she didn't have any of her own children. But God finally blessed her with two sons. And Joseph, of course, became quite famous in Egypt. He became more or less the prime minister, you might say. He basically saved all the household of Jacob when he brought them into Egypt. And Benjamin, Esther and Paul were Benjamites. So sadly, Rachel, when she passed away unexpectedly, she was buried on the side of a road, not with the patriarchs. And not because Jacob didn't want her to be buried along with the family, but they were traveling at that time, and it was an unexpected death. And there was no way they could preserve her, you might say, after death, and then go to the place where the family was, the cemetery. So she had to be buried along the side of the road. And as I mentioned, she was relatively young, maybe 30, 40 years old at the time. So we find here that Leah and Rachel, were the matriarchs of the nation of Israel. They weren't perfect, just human, subject to the stresses and circumstances of life. But at the end, they didn't let the bitterness, the rivalry, self-pity, deceit really rob them of their ultimate faith in God. And they were honored by future generations as being the matriarchs of the nation of Israel. So perhaps another lesson we can learn from this is that we can't be miserable about what we don't have, And what we do have is the true love of our triune God. And that's what Leah and Rachel based their faith on, the true love of God. So we see here God took a very broken family and made it into a great nation. And God's blessings flowed from Israel to the rest of the world through Jesus Christ. And so the ultimate descendant was Christ through Israel. And Christ came out of a crazy, messed up family. Now he offers salvation to everyone. So we have to remember God is sovereign no matter what. And he can turn any situation from very bad to very good. Okay? Amen.